Hi everyone, welcome back. Communication and Conflict YouTube channel. Alan here, promoting mindful communication growth through conflict. So today I want to talk about Principle 6 from my book, A Guide to Effective Communication for Conflict Resolution. And Principle 6 is that we speak but not too often or for too long. So the point of any of the principles is it's to help us look at our own contribution to communication. It can often be that we might perceive another person as speaking too long or too often, and that's become an experience that we found difficult because for good reason we might feel we're not able to contribute to a discussion. But sometimes it's obviously possible that we're overlooking our own tendency to speak too often or for too long. And that's fine because we're all prone to doing it. We all might come to do that at different times. But the more we can become mindful of our communication, which is what the book is all about, the more we're likely to be able to come to recognize where that may be an inhibitor to effective communication that we're having with someone. So I want to talk today about different aspects of how this principle applies. So in a sense, quite obviously, for me, as an example, when I'm providing training for people, there's a risk that I might just stand at the front and talk. And because the training that I provide is experiential and interactive, that risks obstructing the point of the training, which is to actually enable people to learn a lot from themselves, to reflect on things themselves, about their own experience, their own viewpoints on things, and then bring that into a discussion. Whereas if I'm standing at the front talking all the time, that doesn't facilitate that possibility. So one of the things I have to be very wary of as a trainer is that I don't speak for too long or too frequently, that I try to make sure that my contribution is not as small as possible, because obviously there may be things I need to input into the training, but as small as necessary, let's put it that way, so that I'm not overstepping the time that I take to speak about things, and also that I don't come in too often, that I allow people to kind of have space to talk to each other, that it's not always me that's answering questions, that it gives space for people to answer questions amongst themselves when someone might raise a question about something, because then it becomes experiential learning. It becomes learning from each other as much as anything that I might be inputting. So obviously I'm the trainer, so I'm there to input certain things, but it's important that people are able to take on board the point of what I'm saying, not by just being spoon-fed it, but by being given a chance to practice it, to experience it, and to come to their own understandings of it. So as a trainer, it's important that I speak, but not too often or for too long. And as well as that, in many situations, perhaps if we're in a difficult situation, or perhaps we're in a situation where there is some kind of conflict with another person, sometimes our tendency can be to say a lot to try to kind of overwhelm the other person's arguments or viewpoints with the number of viewpoints that we have about things. Now, that's kind of counterproductive, because in a way, if we're going to move forward in the situation, while we'll have a lot to say about our perspective, if we don't open up to hearing the other person's perspective on things, because we believe we just got to kind of keep coming up with our reasons and justifying our reasons and adding one more thing after another, after another, after another, we may think that that's kind of winning the battle if we see it that way, which in itself, as I've said on other occasions, isn't ultimately going to lead to any form of resolution. But what it's not doing is it's not allowing the other person to put their perspective, so they then feel at least that we've listened to them. And so therefore, even if we do manage to completely overwhelm them with our continuous interruptions or our continuous kind of monologues about the difficulty, it means that even though they disagree with us, they'll perhaps just not try to communicate with us, and the problem will remain in place, and their objections to our perspective, or their obstructions to it, or their resistances to doing things the way we think things should be done, will manifest in other ways. Because if they haven't been allowed the space to speak and to present their view, then they'll simply just take actions which go against our view in other ways. So speaking, but not too often or for too long, is also really important in a difficult situation, in a kind of a dispute situation or an argument. Because if we have the view that we just got to overwhelm and kind of just kind of overwhelm the other person with our points of view, it might mean that we don't get to hear their objections or their different point of view, but that doesn't mean to say that actually anything's changed in the situation. So we're kind of deluding ourselves by presenting one thing after another, after another, after another, after another, on a kind of continuous basis. It doesn't actually change anything, to the extent that really ultimately we almost need not bother, because it won't succeed in actually changing people's point of view. It would just give them a sense we're not open to listening to them. So that's another reason why that we speak but not too often or for too long is important in difficult situations. So it's relevant in situations where we might be presenting something or training people in something. It's also important when we're involved in a dispute situation that we don't just keep speaking, or we don't keep commenting on a frequent basis. So either for too long or too frequently for too often. So another thing that can sometimes be a reason why we might have a tendency to speak too often or for too long is because maybe we're carrying over a kind of a memory from school where we might have wanted to be seen to have known a lot about the topic that, say, a teacher is talking about. And so we kept kind of putting our hand up and giving our view and, getting told, oh, yes, well done, that was a good point, or whatever. But while that may be relevant, I'm not even sure that's a good practice to encourage, as if it's kind of a big competition in a classroom, but having been an ex-teacher. But even if that is the nature of the classroom environment, in a different environment, say at a meeting or at work, continuously kind of contributing or perhaps speaking at length, we may come to a view that we're kind of being impressive by doing so. But unfortunately, what often it might lead to instead is the perception that we're not someone who's willing to listen. So if we are someone who attends a meeting and thinks, okay, I've got a lot to say about this, and it's important that everybody hears that I know a lot about this, or whenever someone raises a problem, I feel I've got to come up with an answer because it's important that I look like I know the answer to this question, and that I'm the expert or whatever. While we may see it that way, there's a strong possibility that people won't see it that way, and they will see us as just simply someone who doesn't listen and doesn't engage in a kind of a shared exploration of a topic, rather than be seen as kind of almost seeking to dictate the answer to a topic. So there isn't a sense of cooperation in the way that we do things. So that's another context in which speaking too often or for too long can lead to our practice reducing the effectiveness of the communication. So if we stop and consider the extent to which we do that, then it will help us to look at whether we are actually contributing constructively to a meeting, or whether we're perhaps wanting to just be seen to stand out. And the two things aren't necessarily the same. Well, I would say almost never the same, to be honest. For me, another context in which, just on a personal level, I find the idea of someone speaking too often and for too long is at a conference where there's a very common, and I would say quite often unquestioned, practice of there being speakers. So you might have any number, 50, 300, 1,000 people attend a conference, and you'll have someone stand at the front and just speak for an hour, maybe, with no interaction with the rest of the people at the conference, just sitting there. And for me, the thing about that is it doesn't actually acknowledge that there may be an enormous amount of insight, knowledge, creativity, different perspectives, different views amongst all the people in the audience that doesn't get a chance to be drawn upon. And it could literally be a whole day of a conference where the only people's views that are heard are the 3 or 4 speakers. I mean, sometimes there's kind of 5 or 10 minutes at the end for questions, although that's not always the case. And it's suggested sometimes that the coffee breaks is where people get a chance to speak, but even there, they're only speaking in small groups of 3 or 4. There isn't a shared intention or commitment to giving as many as people as possible an opportunity to discuss the topic in question. And so I always find conferences of that nature to be for me personally, quite a frustrating loss of opportunity to actually draw upon the contributory ideas, perspectives, creativity of all the people who would have attended that conference. It really does kind of feel like a bit of a sad kind of suppression, I would say. Not necessarily a malicious suppression, but it's just not allowed that as many people as possible can engage in the topic. There is a kind of a practice of it being kind of spoon-fed to a passive audience rather than there be an engagement, which for me is always the way in which new ideas and innovation are able to be promoted and optimized on any given topic. It's very rare, I would say, that simply having one person speak at a group of people is the most creative and most resourceful use of that opportunity. So that to me is one more context in which speaking too often or for too long is not as effective an opportunity to create useful and creative communication as perhaps there could be. But there is a kind of a final aspect to this which kind of looks at it from the other side, because quite often a concern can be, and it particularly arises in dispute situations, but a concern can be even if it's not reached a kind of formal stage of a dispute, that there can be a perception that meetings will mean simply having to listen to a particular person talking at length and never, giving space, and it will just be boring and an ineffective meeting. And what I'm always interested in when people say that that's what their meetings are like is that they will often not talk about why it is they're still attending those meetings if they're not finding them useful, and that's entirely understandable. You might go to a meeting and what the person who speaks in your view, the topic that the person is speaking about is not one of interest to you. It may not be of interest to you or to me if it's me in the situation, but it may be of interest to other people. So it may well be that even though we feel the person is speaking too often or for too long, other people in the room may be actually very glad that they're speaking about what they're speaking about and may find what they're saying interesting. But in a sense, even if we don't have a belief that that's true and we think that everybody in the room is bored or kind of frustrated, the question has to be, well, why are we still attending that meeting if it's not serving our purpose? We could say, well, we have to, but do we have to? If we're wanting the meeting to be a good use of our time, and maybe it's a work meeting, then surely our work would want us to optimize our use of time. So while we might say it's a waste of time and it's not serving a purpose, then we have a responsibility to do something about that, to either not continue to attend, or if we do genuinely have to attend. And I would often kind of press that question to the extent to which that really, really is true, particularly if it were to be said to the person who we think has that expectation of us, that we did say to them, well, actually, I'm not finding it very useful to attend that meeting. So I would personally say my time would be better spent doing something else. If they want us to make use of their time as best as possible, then presumably they would be open to hearing that. But if we do genuinely feel that we have no choice in attending, then what are we doing to try to address that? And I'm not going to go into detail here, but in the book itself, I do talk about many of the things that you can do in such situations to actively support there being a change in a situation where, if we do feel we've got to be in a meeting and we can't kind of do other things instead, but we do feel that someone is speaking too often or for too long, there are many things we can do to try to optimize that experience for ourselves. Because the only other choice really is for us to turn up reluctantly, feel bored, not find it's a good use of their time, when actually there are things that we could do that could make that use of time better for ourselves. So that's kind of the final thing I would say about speaking not too often or for too long. If you have any thoughts or questions about what I've said, please put them in the comment section below or contact me by email. And if you liked what I've said, please press the like button. Subscribe if you'd like to see more of these videos. If you think you'd like to find out more about the different principles that I'm speaking about in these videos, then please buy the book. See you next time. Thanks for listening as always. Bye bye.